What is truth, Terence?
Oh, that's an easier question. What one is sure of? Very little, I would think. Well, I'm getting ready to say nothing. I guess that's what it is. Everything is provisional. What I believe in is what I called, and I mentioned it last night, the felt presence of immediate experience, the primary datum. I'm very aware that everything else is a construct moving out from that. And so the primary datum is the first level of being. But to say I believe in it, in Western philosophy, Descartes, and that would be in 1625, said, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And that seemed to make sense for 200 years. It was an effort to get back to the most basic statement you could make. I, the given, think, the datum of immediate experience. But then, the therefore is an enormous abyss of assumption that may have made sense to Descartes, but it does not make sense to modern people. I think what we can say is, I think. If you're not thinking, then you are no more than the onrush of your metabolism and not greatly different from your cat or your dog. Well, thinking, we're not making here a distinction between thinking and feeling. What I mean when I say thinking, or the felt presence of immediate experience, is more like what most people call feeling. It's the awareness of being, in its most simple sense. Now, then there is this curious congruency, which is not well understood by anybody, between mathematics and nature. So we have now a couple more things to play with. We have the felt presence of immediate experience, the I which feels, and then we have as mental objects in the given datum of experience both mathematical structures and the given natural world. And there is some deep and profound congruence between these two, and the relationship is not understood by anybody. To me, this is really the question. Why does mathematics describe nature? That's a deeper question than most. And so I live by questions. I don't see how you can live any other way. You have to remember we're animals, we're meat, we're specks of replicating organic chemistry on the surface of a planet. If we can make a model of our environment that seems to us a sufficiently clear mirror, that is probably about as far as you can go. The idea that we can actually cognize the dynamic of being is it's a noble hope. I try to do it. I actually try to create a complete explanation, but I always call them models because you have to throw them away. You have to keep adding to the model and then throwing it away. The real justification for psychedelics is that they feed new data into your model. What we're doing is triangulating points in some kind of phase space. And if you go to Paris, you know more about reality than people who don't. And if you smoke DMT, you know more about reality than people who don't. And so the idea is to triangulate a sufficiently large number of data points in your set of experience that you can make a model of the world that is not imprisoning. That's why, second to psychedelics, I think travel is the most boundary-dissolving educational enterprise that you can get mixed up in. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think one problem is with with everything we experience in outside or with psychedelics is that we're experiencing only more or less what we are believing, with some variabilities. So maybe we can see, there's a possible other world. There is something more, and maybe that's all. Maybe I can understand the experience in my personal life, but I can't take it for real. It's in some way real, but I have to check out if I'm producing this. If I believe that, for example, the world is bad, then I will experience a bad other world, something like this. So I never can be sure of this because of my belief system. I'm producing this.
Well, in what you say, there's a strongly expressed dichotomy between self and world. I mean, this question of reality, non-reality, and so on. But you can perform a kind of philosophical reduction and satisfy yourself that the self and world distinction is not primary. You know, that who looks through your eyes is the world. Yeah, I would probably buy into that. That it shows us that there is something else. Although I do think that the way ideas emerge into culture, which happens naturally without psychedelics, is probably accelerated by psychedelics. I think the experience over the past 1,000 years is that ideology is poisonous. You have two kinds of ideologies that we've experimented with over the past 1,000 years. Unsuccessful ones, where I would nominate I suppose Christianity, and successful ones like science. And it turns out whether they're successful or unsuccessful, the consequences for the rest of us are pretty horrendous. The world seen through the lens of ideology is a very limited world, and the great catastrophes of the past 1,000 years have been brought on by ideological errors. That's why, I'm very suspicious of this thing I talked about last night that I called the world corporate state. But on the other hand, the world corporate state seems to be less ideological than any organizing entity that we've seen in a long time. It has no real ideology other than it wants to do business, which is hardly, a cosmic vision.
Yeah, we've had a major shift as far as this corporate state is concerned in the last 10, 20, 30 years. And that is the shareholder is wanting more than dividends now. The shareholder, who is also the consumer, wants responsibility of the corporate state. So the management of these corporate states are having to adapt themselves to provide what their shareholders and their consumers want.
Yeah, well, so what you're saying is it's being modified from the bottom up.
Exactly.
Yeah. But I think that what electronic culture permits is incredible diversity, and that what the print-created world demanded and created was tremendous suppression of diversity. Print created concepts like the citizen. That's a print-created notion. It created concepts like the public. There was no public before print. That idea didn't even exist. So we now define ourselves as, I'm a member of the public. I'm a citizen. These are very curious categories where you discover yourself a member of very large organizations that you never remember joining. You just sort of were born into it. What the electronic culture empowers is diversity, eccentricity, and a pluralistic kind of mix. And that's very threatening to the print mind, because the print mind is all about controlling through having groups of people that you can deal with. That's why, in a sense, print or television served a print agenda for the first 20 years of its existence, because it was used in the network form, which is only one way to do TV. In that form, the real impact of television could be masked for a long time, because by having millions of people watch the same TV programs, there is a tendency to overcome the deconstructural impulse in TV, and it begins to act like print. Now, of course, that's breaking down, and the only people who watch network TV live in trailer courts. But there was a time when, you see, that's what happened. What was everybody's media 25 years ago has become the media of the lower middle class, and then everybody else, the lower class, has fallen into its own media, underground radio stations, boom boxes, and this. And then the upper echelons of society have gone to computer networks, email, fiber optics, and view-on-demand TV. Television, is, to my mind, the most insidious drug that the 20th century has had to deal with. And, it is a drug. It's the first of the electronic drugs, and its impact, if it were heroin, people would be alarmed. That people are, on average, watching 6 hours a day of TV, and I don't even think it's a content problem. I think television itself is toxic. It's not how many murders you witness, it's the actual This is what McLuhan was always trying to say, that people couldn't understand what he meant when he said that the medium was the message. The message is not the message. The medium was the message. And the effects it had, we have millions of people who are warehoused in almost a larval state in their apartments, watching TV, paying for their medical plans, and glued to this mindless opera of cultural decay that is recited day after day in front of them. It's horrible to imagine. And this is, a creation to some degree of the world corporate state that probably has to be addressed. Yeah.
There's a wonderful book that's just come out called Media Virus by Douglas Rushkoff that addresses this problem really very well. Have you read that? I haven't read that.
I know Doug. His other book, Siberia, is a nice look at cyberculture. Interesting.
What do you think is going to happen with this video, TV, whatever?
I think that the most important cultural event happening right now is the explosive growth of the internet and the web. The idea that with my $1,200 PowerBook, I can access 3,000 computers around the planet by just plugging into a telephone jack is staggering. This is a revolution of orders of magnitude, and that has happened completely invisibly. Nobody's windows had to be rocked out, and no camps had to be nothing appears to have changed. The people who are not switched on don't even know anything has happened. To them, the world looks exactly like it looked 5 years ago. To the people who are switched on, Earth is becoming a distant memory. Of the internet?
Yes.
Well, the internet is the global brain, the cyber-spatially connected, telepathic, collective domain that we've all been hungering for. It is so powerful, and it has arisen with incredible speed and by a very insidious fashion. I mean, first of all, as I mentioned last night, the internet was originally called ARPANET. It was the Advanced Research Projects Agency. It was this super secret military industrial thing that they wanted to survive a thermonuclear attack. And so they designed it to be unkillable. It has no central switching zone. If you blow up a part of it, it just flows around the part you blow up. It is unkillable. So that was ARPA. And now it's become public domain, and it's incredibly empowering for any minority because you can find your peers. It doesn't matter what you're into. You know, you can play the Shanai and join the Shanai playing society. So no matter how eccentric your interest, you can find common ground out there. Then the other thing is information that, I'm not kidding you, 10 years ago, the director of the CIA sitting at his desk in Langley, Virginia, didn't have the information processing capacity that you now have plugging into your PowerBook at any phone jack in the world, because these databases are there. And if you know how to surf the net, if you know how to program your no-bots so that while you're sleeping they're sorting through and visiting various sites and downloading and looking, you cannot believe what's out there. I mean, the entire planet has been turned into a local telephone call. And not only, not to talk to people, but to talk, when you go on to the NCSA main page in Batavia, Illinois, it says available resources. You click on that and 1,500 computers come on, the names of them, and you just point and click, and now you're talking to that computer. And it tells you that the really interesting thing is being stored on another computer, not in Madrid, but in Singapore. And you point and click. Now you're talking to the main menu in Singapore. You go out onto the net. In the course of an hour of moving on the net, you may circle the planet 10 times and talk to 50 computers all over the world, and you're downloading files and you're tracing your path so that you can go back. And this is happening. It's been happening for quite some time. 30 million people are out there, and because it requires literacy and technology and money, those 30 million people probably are probably only 10% of the people who rule the planet are not on that net. And it's where the cultural architecture is being put in place now. And it's this invisible space, which is where we should have been building all the time. So I think this is the doorway into the new dimension into which we're going, and that these technologies, put in place for no reason other than to facilitate bank transfers and do incredibly mundane things, are turning out to be the seeds of our electromagnetic body in hyperspace. Yeah.
Can you elaborate on your understanding of virtual cities being designed using computer nets?
Well, it's simply that you want to create an interface with a bunch of data. And a very crude way to do it is to have a page with a list of computers, and you click and you go to the computer. That works, but it's not very sexy. Well, but what if we made a three-dimensional landscape and put buildings in that landscape so that the large red rectangle is the AT&T database, the low violet group of integrated triangles is the National Medical Database. In other words, you simply make the icons three-dimensional and analogous to buildings, and then you can build Data Town, where, instead of a list of computers, they appear to be a long line of skyscrapers lining a broad avenue in which you're driving down in a Ferrari or something. All this will come. I mean, the engineers will do it. How it looks is immaterial. It's that it can be done anyway. Yeah.
Well, from what you're saying, it feels like this is going to be a very intellectual, snobbish, it's going to be elitism. Because there's only going to be for a long time, a certain level of intellectual capacity, illiteracy, literate, educational. So it's going to absolutely pull apart and make the class system even more.
No, I think you're absolutely right that this is happening. This is part of the problem, that what is happening, you see, part of the illusion of the political history of the past 40 years was the illusion that we were all Presbyterians, we all ate white bread, and we all lived in the suburbs, and we all were white folks. And now the society is fragmenting. You're right. There are people who can't read by the millions in this society. Meanwhile, other people are reaching for informational technologies so powerful that they can barely be conceived of. And this is the consequence of political mismanagement. I think the American Union is flying to pieces because the notion of polity was betrayed in the 1960s. And that since the middle of the 1960s, this has been a police state of some sort. You see, after World War II, and they kicked Hitler's ass and all that, then everybody came back full of idealism to raise families, to build America. They'd been through the New Deal. There was a modicum of social responsibility and consciousness hammered into the middle class. And everybody came back. And then the American political system went haywire. And basically because we lost our nerve. My generation, I'm 48, I went to the University of California at Berkeley in 1965. My generation was the beneficiary of the idea that you should give a universal education to everybody. And they discovered that if you do that, if you take everybody and make them read Plato and John Stuart Mill and Voltaire and Hobbes, as we did, that, you can't rule such people. They take it too seriously. They become ungovernable. They pour into the streets screaming about their rights. And so in the aftermath of the suppression of the counterculture of the 60s, it was decided that the goal of universal public education and the building of a population intelligent enough to run a democracy, that would all be abandoned. And the universities would be turned into trade schools, and people would be given MBAs and incorporated into the corporate state. But no more John Stuart Mill, no more of that. And the consequences of this have been to create a historyless and illiterate lower middle class, where before the lower middle class was the pool of our intellectual creativity. That's where John Steinbeck came from, and Henry Miller, and all of the people who drove the evolution of cultural values. So, and, we could talk endlessly about what went wrong in the 60s or why we were turned into a police state. But now, the impulse of those kinds of repressive states is to forestall change. And change has been forestalled in America to the point where now, when it comes, it's going to be explosive, uncontrollable, revolutionary. We will be lucky to get through this political cycle ahead of us without having to hang some of these people.
Well, isn't this part of the whole point of what's going on right now?
You mean that there is this tremendous, now we're going to have the change, yeah, the change which should have been spread out over 30 years is now going to come in the next 5, no matter who it hurts, no matter how chaotic it is. Well, I don't know how we got off on that. The role of psychedelics in all of this is that it erodes loyalty to the models of the tribe. And so we are the people who can see, and there may be others, I'm not claiming exclusivity for the psychedelic community, but the psychedelic community loudly proclaims that the emperor has no clothes. This is all a con game. That this junk-dealing, hyper-media-obsessed, nitwit society is an unfit environment for delinquent 14-year-olds, let alone for the rest of us. And this is news they don't like to hear. Well, I think these things are always more interesting if they're driven by the agendas of the people here. You got a fairly long hit of me this morning. If there are any areas that you want to bring into focus, this is a good time to suggest it. Otherwise, I'll just launch into another meandering diatribe, and like that. Yes?
I'm interested in more on the ayahuasca.
There's a book which I'm not sure it's been published yet, but you should all watch for it. I hope will make a revolution in ayahuasca awareness. It's called The 3 Halves of Imomosho, and it was translated by a good friend of many people in this room, Ken Symington translated it, and it's by the Peruvian poet Cesar Calvo. And it is a book about ayahuasca that could easily win the Nobel Prize for Literature. It's not some panting anthropological reportage. It's art and incredibly rich. And if you get a chance, you should read it. If you're interested in this subject, another book about ayahuasca that is no easy read is a book with the unlikely title of Shamanism, Colonialism, and the Wild Man by Michael Taussig. And it is an intellectual journey to places you never thought you'd pass through.
Could you spell the title of the first one, The 3 Halves of what?
Imomosho, I-M-O space M-O-X-O. The 3 Halves of Imomosho. So, I don't know how much more there is to say about ayahuasca. From a phenomenological point of view, what's interesting is that it seems to hover on the edge of being a telepathic drug of some sort. And in fact, for the first 30 years of the 20th century, the active principle was actually called telepathine. And these German chemists and Theodor Koch-Grünberg and people like that were very interested in this. And then it was realized that it was actually harming a previously discovered substance. But it isn't the kind of telepathy where you see what other people are thinking. Or hear what they're thinking. It's more that you actually see what is meant. You have an experience of meaning related to seeing that is like wisdom. I mean, it's hard to explain, but whole societies are guided by people who are intoxicated by this material. Yeah.
Terence, have any experiments been published that actually demonstrated those telepathic powers, or was it purely subjective?
Well, no, I think it's slightly in a different realm. I don't think it will show up on like a card-turning test or something like that. It is not telepathy. It's a different modality of mind is what it is. Through song and sound, the boundaries are dissolved. But I don't know if you can set up a scientific scale that can detect this.
It's more like taking on the mind of nature rather than something.
That's right. It's that there is a shared state of mind, but it is not a sharing of states of mind.
I think I understand.
You see what I mean? Yeah.
Have you done any comparative studying on other substances in different other cultures? For example, the Haitians and the voodoo and the substances that they work with, and I suppose other people all over the globe?
Well, see, it's a very complicated question, because cultural values enter into the definition of what is an acceptable or desirable intoxication. And there's a whole smorgasbord of possibilities offered by nature, from things which are incredibly pleasant and, aphrodisiac and so forth, through a range of things which nobody would ever do more than once. But then there's a kind of an intermediate range. I mean, if you can recall your first shot of scotch, this is a shocking thing to your system. I mean, your body does not readily take to that. And voodoo is operating on these substances called tetrodotoxins that come from puffer fish that are much closer to being poisons than to being psychedelics, where people are taken out in the bushes and given something, and their stomach cramps and everything turns yellow, and they fall down on the ground and they twitch and they vomit and they beg to die and they want to die, and then 10 hours later they're fine. And they're brought down to the river and slapped around and washed off and given a piece of white cloth and told, now you're a full-fledged member of society. That's an ordeal poison. And it acts, in some ways, very much like a psychedelic. Because if the purpose of a psychedelic trip is to get you back to your foundation, thinking you're going to die like a dog in the ditch is also wonderful for doing that. See, I think different cultures have made use of whatever was available to them. And we, as a global culture, can look over the entire set of options and say, well, here's a plant which makes you see visions but also sterilizes you for 5 years, and here's something else which does something else, and we can actually choose the best of these tools. This is the great leg up that we have on the Aboriginal cultures. We are, as it were, a kind of clearinghouse for all of that information. And out of all of those many, many options, it turns out there are easy ways in. Not totally easy, but easier ways in. And so you have to learn which are the easy ways in, the paths which can be followed at all. Yeah, Jesse?
You had said something to me over lunch about ayahuasca and vomiting, and it made the idea of vomiting more tolerable. I don't know what it was, but I have a lot of resistance to ayahuasca because as a child I vomited every day when my mother forced orange juice down me.
Well, I think what I said was it gets easier. As you take, like the second ayahuasca trip is easier than the first generally, and what that implies is that this vomiting that you're doing is actually a shedding of toxins. And this is certainly how they view it. They call it la purga, the purge, and they culturally value and encourage vomiting. Another interesting thing about ayahuasca is that there's nothing in it that doesn't occur in the ordinary human brain. There's just more of ordinary brain chemistry there. So that implies that these extraordinary states of mind, group-mindedness, three-dimensional hallucinations and so forth, are nevertheless not that far removed from ordinary states of brain chemistry. And in an enlightened environment of medical research, these things would be studied. As it is, it's all very messed up by politics.
But what's about the tradition? I know that in these cultures they have mythologies and they have a tradition.
Uh-huh.
So if you transform or transfer these things to, for example, the States or Western Europe, there isn't any mythology, a common mythology.
No, well, you can never escape your own identity. I mean, you can never experience what they experience. Conversely, they can never experience what you experience. I mean, I've been up against this, where you're sitting around in a hut on your haunches, covered with pig grease and waiting for something to come on, and inevitably, my mind would drift to Husserl's general phenomenology of ideas, and I would try to perform the eidetic reduction, and then it would just make me burst out laughing. The idea that, I wonder how many people in the room are performing the eidetic reduction at this moment. Not many. So people have criticized me because I don't ally myself with anthropology. I'm really interested in these things as tools for understanding experience. The cultures that have discovered them often have very narrow interpretations of them. Another thing is, some cultures are afraid of the unconscious and encourage going only a very short distance in, And I think once you get the idea that it can't really kill you, and sometimes it's hard to talk yourself into this, but if you can convince yourself of that, then just the thrill of it. And in a way that's possible because we are deprogrammed from ideology. Anyone else except a secular late 20th century person would take a look at this and assume it was God Almighty and behave appropriately. We look at it and say, well, it can't be God Almighty, it must be something else, and then, explore it in an experiential fashion. Yeah.
So you talk about ayahuasca as almost like a joyride on some level, like it's one of the question I have is, what are when you take ayahuasca and psilocybin and acid, those three things, what does each one specifically, if you can take in a nutshell what direction each one goes, what could you say if you made a sentence for each one of those to understand the difference?
Well, a sentence, a boundary I may not be able to tolerate. Well, just roughly, the feeling with ayahuasca is that it's Gaian. It's earth-oriented. You feel the river, you feel the jungle, you feel the drama and pain and nobility of life and death, and it's visceral, it's about the meat and the jungle, and it's feminine. And then the character of the hallucinations is, it's as though it's like a camera eye. It's largely silent, but it's just an eye that is moving through a vast matrix of visual information. And after a good ayahuasca trip, you just feel like you want to rub your eyes. You say, I've just been looking and looking. It's like a trip to Madison Avenue with money in your pocket. You've just been looking and looking and looking and looking for hours at this stuff. And it's almost invariably beautiful in a jeweled, filigreed, multi-leveled, transparent, glittering, flowing kind of way. And it almost always takes place against a black background for some reason. It goes on against a black background. Okay, then psilocybin, which is just an atom's twist away, is a very different creature. The most astonishing thing about psilocybin, and you're hearing this from, a materialist of some sort, is that it speaks. It has a voice. And if you don't think this is confounding to the rational mind, to come upon this in the detritus of your mind's attic, it can talk to you. and astound you with its insight, humor, ability to connect and make insightful inclusions and so forth and so on. And the whole thing, the whole psilocybin experience is imbued with this eerie energy, which has different names, but elfin, gnomic, extraterrestrial. They're shiny-eyed and small, and there's chattering. And the other thing is there are machines. The psilocybin visions have a tendency to drift toward technoscapes, enormous machines in orbit around alien planets, and strange architectonic forms where you don't know whether you're wandering around inside somebody's cathedral or their television set. And the whole thing has this off-world, we are the Galactarian civilization, we hold the key to the history of this sector of the Kiliocosm, it's this kind of thing, almost blast of trumpets and the ringing up of cosmic curtains. It's very, very dramatic, Wagnerian, and forward-looking. It's about the destiny of the race and why planets are put in place and what it's all for. Could hardly be different from ayahuasca, and yet, an atom's twist away. Then DMT, rests in some even weirder domain of triangulation. DMT, you don't only hear the voice, but if you get a sufficiently heroic dose, it's like you break through into the control room where all the secrets are being run from and built, and there's this unbelievable sense of finding out beyond your wildest dreams of ever finding out. And it's an inhabited mind space of some sort that is so unexpected and so convincingly real that you actually, I think, a person who doesn't fear for their sanity has already lost it at that point, because it is without a doubt, absolutely the last thing you ever expected to have happen to you, that you would burst into some place somewhere where there would be these chattering, self-transforming linguistic creatures that are made out of light and punning intentionality and are trying to get you to perform some unimaginable task that is somehow caught up with the unravelment of the space-time continuum and the destiny of the species and so forth and so on. And, this is at 30 seconds into a trip that lasts a minute and a half, and then you're returned to, you and your friends and your concerns. LSD is not animated in this way. It is more like the classical expectation people have, I think, who have not taken these things, of what a psychedelic drug should be. In other words, you think clearer, you see connections, you can hold very complex ideas in your mind and rotate them and look at them from many angles. You experience emotional abreactions, you recover childhood memories, you are able to straighten your karma out with people, you are undergoing rapid psychological growth under the influence of LSD, but it doesn't. The reason I am not so keen on LSD is that I'm really a plant guy, not a drug guy, and it's something about these substances that have been carried along in the genomes of these plants for, in some cases, hundreds of millions of years, and why? What are these things doing for the plants? And then how can a molecule so simple, this is another puzzle in all of this, these molecules are planar That means they're flat, they're simple, sometimes 20, 30 atoms. And yet they totally transform your entire consciousness. This is the equivalent of a red ant who can rip down the Empire State Building in an hour and a half. I mean, why is mind so delicately poised that such a tiny amount of pharmaceutical material can create such vast changes? And then another puzzle, as long as I'm listing my favorite mysteries, and this is the one that really got me into this in the beginning, because my early inclination was toward art history. And that is a very simple question. Where do the images come from? Where does this stuff come from? I mean, it is so unreferent to the ocean of commercially produced imagery in which we swim. You know, we are constantly bombarded by the images of television and Hollywood and so forth and so on. And yet the psychedelic species of visual beauty is not, we don't see it in our furniture styles and our architecture. It seems to be coming in literally from another dimension, and yet it is undeniably moving. It's beautiful. And I am puzzled why I, as an ordinary person, under the influence of, let us say, 30 milligrams of psilocybin, can see more art in an hour than Western civilization has produced in the past 1,000 years. And that tells you how little of we're getting from the art river back to the village where we can drink it. Niagaras of beauty are flowing by, untapped by ordinary consciousness. And, you know, would that we could send robots who could film these psychedelic realities. Perhaps, you know, virtual reality will develop into a technology where we are able finally to reconstruct and agree upon the content of the psychedelic experience. But to me, that's almost like the metaphysical stamp of approval on the psychedelic experience. Beauty is the presence of so much beauty is an argument to me that truth cannot be far away. Yeah.
Are you aware of any spontaneous trips without the plants?
Well, you know, there's a whole vast area of human endeavor called mystical religion, and there's a whole other vast area of human endeavor called madness. And many stories abound and come out of these areas. I think that what we're talking about here, whether we're talking about madness, mysticism, or psychedelics, is a brain state. For the schizophrenic, it is uninvited and terrifying. For the mystic, it's achieved by excruciating acts of asceticism in most cases, which certainly have profound physiological consequences on the neuroecology of the brain. And for the smart money, I think, you use a shamanic technology. I think religion, organized religion of the high classical sort, you know, Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, and so on, is very anxious about this whole issue, precisely because religion is always anxious about the issue of direct revelation. That was what shattered religious consensus in Europe. That's what the Protestant Reformation was about, doctrinally. I mean, there were many things going on, but the doctrinal argument was, is it the job of specialists called theologians to study scripture called revelation in order to tell the rest of us what God's plan is? Or is it better for each of us to look within the confines of our own souls and have our own dialogue with God and figure it out? And that was basically the Protestant position, and it went against hierarchical theology. Yeah.
I recently read about a mushroom called fly agaric, and can you comment on its role in history?
Oh, these are amazingly complicated questions, or either that or I've overeducated myself. Could be, huh? Well, there is a whole domain of controversy and discourse about the role of mushrooms in human culture. Because it was noticed by Gordon Wasson in the 1950s that there are invariably there are two kinds of cultural attitudes toward mushrooms. One is called mycophilic, and if you want to know what mycophilism is, go to Russia, go to Poland, go to Czechoslovakia, where people have hundreds of words for mushrooms. Several holidays a year are set aside to collect mushrooms. Children are named after mushrooms, so forth and so on. The Slavs are into mushrooms. Well, then if you want to know what a mycophobic culture is, go to rural England, where there are no mushrooms, there are only toadstools, and don't touch them, please, they're highly poisonous. That's the general English attitude toward mushrooms. So Gordon Wasson wrote about this all through the 50s and 60s, and he decided that you all probably have seen, if not the real thing, a plaster cast or depicted in schmaltzig European illustrative style, the famous mushroom of fairy tales, the red mushroom with the white dots. Well, that is Amanita muscaria, and it grows in a symbiotic mycorrhizal relationship to spruce and birch trees, and is used by the shaman of the Irkut language group and the Amur River Basin. And now it just happens that those people in the Amur River Basin were the first people studied by the new science of anthropology when it wanted to study shamanism. By chance, this was. And so ever since, the science of shamanism, whether we're talking about the shamans of the Amazon Basin, Central China, South India, or Tierra del Fuego, has had to labor within the categories created by the people who studied the shamanism of the Amur River Basin. And the use of the Amanita muscaria was tremendously overstressed by Wasson, I think. He wrote a book called Soma, the Divine Mushroom of Immortality, in which he argued that Amanita muscaria was the Soma of the Rig Vedas. You may not know it, but the Rig Vedas are largely these hymns composed in the Vedic phase of the Hindu religion to a mysterious intoxicant, Soma. Nobody knows what Soma is, but much scholarly ink and blood has been shed on the question. And Gordon Wasson argued that it had to be Amanita muscaria, and made a case which impressed some people and not others. The most damaging evidence against him was, it's hard as hell to get off on this stuff. And when you finally do get off, the experience is extremely ambiguous. I mean, shivering and salivating and thinking you're losing your marbles is not my idea of the ecstatic ascent to the presence of the pleroma. And a lot of other people thought so too. So then there was lots of hassle about, well then, it did seem that Wasson had secured the case that the Vedic hymns were about a mushroom. That was his breakthrough. But his mistake was he got the mushroom wrong and then created an entire false cultural history based on this error. And, this, I'm not interested in flaying you with my theory, but if you're interested, it's told in the book Food of the Gods. Because, as I mentioned this morning, I think psilocybin was the catalyst that triggered the emergence of self-reflecting consciousness in human beings. And so my mushroom story is not a story of a subarctic toxic mushroom cult that carried itself into India along with the Indo-European invasions. My story is an older story about a mushroom that contained psilocybin and flourished in the grasslands of Africa and was present as nomadism slowly evolved into the domestication of cattle, and as we talked about this morning, the suppression of gender dominance with the addition of psilocybin in the diet created a partnership society that existed up until the invention of agriculture, and climatological change made the mushroom difficult to obtain. And at that very critical juncture, after perhaps 50,000 years of mushroom-induced suppression of hierarchical dominance patterns, the withdrawal of the mushroom from the human diet allowed the old pattern to reassert itself. But at this point, we had language, we had agriculture, and what did we do? We quickly organized monotheistic religions, city-states, warrior castes, god-kingship, the world of the lash and the god-king, basically. And we are the unhappy inheritors of that circumstance to the present day. And that's why our situation is so bizarre and why we are so neurotic, if you will. It's because human consciousness evolved in an entirely different cultural milieu than we now exist in. It evolved in a world in which the Gaian logos was absolutely real to every man, woman, and child in the society. And I believe that the tendency in the hominoids to form monogamous pair bonding was eroded by the presence of psilocybin because it promoted an orgiastic sexual style. And the social consequences of that were that men could not trace lines of male paternity. And so you have an intense impetus toward collective bonding in a group like that, because the children are our children, the children of the group. The nuclear family is, I think, a somewhat maladaptive fragmentation from all of this. And this is important for us to understand because we have practiced a neurotic style of culture for a long, long time. It has permitted the conquest of matter, but that now is done. I mean, once, hydrogen fusion, you can put it in a bottle at Yale, well, then you've been there, done that. And now we have to swing the thing back into balance. The tools that we acquired on the journey of the prodigal son through the world of matter, you cannot redeem the moral cost of that. And yet, unless those tools are brought to bear to now redeem the planet. I mean, if there is any justification for history at all, it must be that it secured a longer evolutionary life for intelligence on the planet. And, as far as how the psychedelics fit into this in the individual scheme, psychedelics are not flashlights into the chaos of the Freudian unconscious. They are tools for mathematically unpacking your mind into a higher dimensional space. In the Newtonian and print-created social space that we're walking around it, you are like a self-extracting archive that hasn't self-extracted itself yet. And then you take psilocybin and you self-extract and unfold. And because think about it, I mean, I'm very serious about this. Think about what the shaman's functions are in the classical Paleolithic model. The shaman's functions are to predict weather, to anticipate the movement of game and enemies, and to heal disease. Well, now, how could you do those three things? Well, the answer is, if you could see into next week, that would be helpful. That would allow you to do all three of those things. Predict the weather, see the movement of game and enemies, and make very astute choices about who you accepted as your patients. You see? And so what we see here is that there's a kind of selection going on for an ability to triangulate complex systems into the future. And I think that now the reason the psychedelic experience is so compelling to me is because I took psychedelics for years with the question, what is it? And then I never could understand what it was. And people said, this is the wrong question, and on and on. But finally I realized, I see what it is. It's everything. It's, that piece of doggerel, I saw eternity the other night, an endless golden ring. Well, that's it. You just rise out of the Newtonian spatial plane and you look back, and there is eternity hanging in space like a galaxy.